Greetings, my friend. We are all interested in the future, for that is where you and I are going to spend the rest of our lives. And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future. You are interested in the unknown, the mysterious, the unexplainable. That is why you are here. And now, for the first time, we are bringing to you the full story of what happened on that fateful day.
Alright, it's Thursday, September 3rd, 2015. This is the SuchBS.com weekly news roundup, where we go beyond the headlines and take a look at stories that are either being misrepresented or underreported by the mainstream corporate news media. So this is all stuff that you're probably not going to see on your TV. Now you have to excuse me today. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit under the weather for the first episode here, but, well, what are you going to do? I originally had intended to include all of this stuff with the BS File, which is another podcast that I'm doing over at www.suchbs.com. Unfortunately, it was just too long. I think I recorded the first episode of that, and it was about 3.5 hours, so I decided to trim the news headlines out. But there's so many stories breaking in the news these days that I've been tracking and following that, well, I still want to get this information out, and I don't want to go a couple weeks between each one. So this will be just a weekly podcast. We'll hit on some of these news headlines and look at what's going on behind the story, what they're not telling you up front, or in a lot of cases, what they're trying to obfuscate or cover up in these stories. So you'll have to bear with me. We've got a lot to cover. I've got a huge backlog here because I originally started writing up these little stories back at the beginning of August 3rd or 6th, somewhere around there. So I've got some possibly some old news, but I think I have a take on it that you probably haven't heard before. And I would certainly believe that the mainstream corporate news media has not touched on these subjects. So we're going to get right into it today. I just want to note that, as always, you can go onto the website and look at all the sources where I gather this information. It's all in the public domain. You don't have to have some special membership or something. This isn't classified information or anything like that. You can go on the internet and look at all this stuff yourself, and I would encourage you to do that. If you find something interesting, dig into it. Take a look at where I got the information from. A lot of times this stuff just pops up in normal news stories. The only problem is it's usually buried somewhere down at the bottom. But without any further wait, let's get right into it today. This is going to be the news roundup number 1. And the first story today I want to cover is kind of an interesting development, because it appears that ISIS, that those dastardly evildoers that we've been chasing around the Middle East now since 2013, well, they seem to have now gone to Ukraine. Alright, so first up, let's look at an article that was published by the New York Times on July 7, 2015. This article is titled, "Islamic Battalions Stocked with Chechens Aid Ukraine in War with Rebels." Alright, and the article starts out like this. Wearing camouflage with a bushy salt and pepper beard flowing over his chest and a bowie knife sheathed prominently in his belt, the man cut a fearsome figure in the nearly empty restaurant. Waiters hovered apprehensively near the kitchen, and, try as he might, the man who calls himself Muslim, a former Chechen warlord, could not wave them over for more tea. Even for Ukrainians hardened by more than a year of war here against Russian-backed separatists, the appearance of Islamic combatants, mostly Chechens, in towns near the front lines comes as something of a surprise, and for many of the Ukrainians, a welcome one. "We like to fight the Russians," said the Chechen, who refused to give his real name. "We always fight the Russians." He commands one of 3 volunteer Islamic battalions out of about 30 volunteer units in total, fighting now in eastern Ukraine. The Islamic battalions are deployed to the hottest zones, which is why the Chechen was here. Okay, skipping down now, let's pull out another couple paragraphs here. The Chechen commands the Sheikh Mansour group, named for an 18th century Chechen resistance figure. It is subordinate to the nationalist right sector, a Ukrainian militia. Neither the Sheikh Mansour group nor right sector is incorporated into the formal police or military, and the Ukrainian authorities decline to say how many Chechens are fighting in eastern Ukraine. They are all unpaid. Apart from an enemy, these groups do not have much in common with Ukrainians, or, for that matter, with Ukraine's Western allies, including the United States. Right sector, for example, formed during last year's street protests in Kiev from a half-dozen fringe Ukrainian nationalist groups like White Hammer and the Trident of Stepan Bandera. Another, the Azov group, is openly neo-Nazi, using the wolf's hook symbol associated with the SS. Without addressing the issue of the Nazi symbol, the Chechen said he got along well with the nationalists because, like him, they love their homeland and hate the Russians. Okay, a couple quick things to note there before we continue on with the article. Number one, it's pretty important that this particular, at least, Islamic battalion, the Sheikh Mansour group, which this gentleman commands, this unnamed Chechen warlord, I should say, he commands the Sheikh Mansour group, and you should note that they are subordinate to the nationalist right sector, a Ukrainian militia. The right sector is a very interesting group. We read a little later on that they were formed from several nationalist groups, such as the White Hammer and the Trident of Stepan Bandera. Now, this group is a far-right fascist group. You should also take note of the fact that the New York Times has decided to whitewash this whole story and cover it up, at least, when they noted that, apart from a common enemy, these groups don't have much in common with Ukrainians, or for that matter, with Ukraine's Western allies, including the United States. However, nothing could be farther from the truth, I have to tell you. Now, we can't really get real deeply into it today because there's just not enough time, but I will be doing a BS file report sometime in the future, probably a few of them, on what's going on in Ukraine and the history of these groups and how they are deeply intertwined with the U.S. government and our intelligence services, including the CIA, because we have a long history with these guys. It's also important to note that they said another group, the Azov Battalion, or the Azov Group, is openly neo-Nazi and uses the wolf's hook symbol associated with the SS. This is important because all these ties, all these intertwining, it has a lot to do with the history of Ukraine, which was occupied by Nazi Germany during World War II. So these groups can trace their lineage directly back to Nazi collaborators in Ukraine. It's very important to note. So you might be wondering, why are these Islamic jihadists mingling with fascists and neo-Nazis? And when I do my full report on this, you'll see that it's not so strange, actually. These two groups have a lot in common. Skipping down the article, let's read one more little section here. For the Ukrainians, the decision to quietly open the front to figures like the Chechen, who are making their way here from Europe and Central Asia, has brought some battle-hardened men to their side. The Chechen had been living in France, and he founded the Chechen battalions last fall, along with Isa Muniev, an emigre from Chechnya who had been living in Denmark. Mr. Muniev, the Chechen said, had received approval from senior members of the Ukrainian government. But, quote, there were no documents, nothing was written, unquote, he said, adding that Mr. Muniev was killed in fighting in February. Okay, and a few things to take away from this part here. Interesting to note that this Chechen warlord founded these Islamic battalions which are fighting in Ukraine last fall, along with a man named Isa Muniev. And his name there, I-S-A, Isa, last name Muniev, M-U-N-A-Y-E-V. This man is pretty important. We're going to touch on him again in a couple minutes. Though one thing you should note is that Mr. Muniev, it is said, had received approval from senior members of the Ukrainian government. And that is important because, well, the senior members of the Ukrainian government were pretty much selected and are puppets of the United States State Department. So if Mr. Muniev received okay for these Islamic battalions to come fight in Ukraine, if he received the okie dokie from the Ukrainian government, high up members, that means he probably received the okie dokie from the U.S. State Department. And again, that may seem like a bold claim, but when we go into the forces that propelled the Ukrainian, the Euromaidan coup, you're going to see that the U.S. was in fact calling the shots in that revolution. But okay, you might be saying, all right, well, we've got some Chechens, all right? These are people from Chechnya. They live up by Russia. I mean, that's not exactly the Middle East where ISIS has been running rampant and taking over towns and whooping up on the Iraqi army. I mean, so what are we really looking at here? Well, let's flesh it out a bit more because, in fact, well, there are Chechens who are linked directly to ISIS. And some of them are, well, they're pretty important in the whole structure of ISIS. All right, we're going to look now at an article that appeared in Al Arabiya News. It was published August 31st, of 2014. It's simply titled, Meet ISIS's New Breed of Chechen Militants. And we're just going to pull a couple quick paragraphs out of this article here. It begins as follows. Following the Islamic State takeover of Mosul, which is in Iraq, its Chechen military leader, Omar al-Shishani, also known as Omar the Chechen, received ample media attention. The man's rise in ISIS ranks has overshadowed the significance of a better established Chechen figure, Murad Margoshvili, aka Muslim al-Shishani, whom activists say has a Che Guevara status among his compatriots in Syria. For many Syrian and foreign fighters, Muslim is known for both his bravery and good looks, according to Sami Hamawi, a media activist in an Islamist brigade who fought with the Chechen leader in the Latakia province. Alright, so take note there that we have two Chechens who are, one is a rising star in the ISIS ranks, Omar al-Shishani, and then we have another, perhaps lesser known, well, not lesser known, but more overshadowed figure, Muslim al-Shishani, whom activists, whatever that means, basically people in the Islamic State and Syrian rebels claim has a Che Guevara-like status in Syria. So basically, the status of the famous Marxist revolutionary. Pretty interesting. Skipping down, let's take another paragraph here. An Islamist source in Raqqa says that while Omar al-Shishani is gaining influence due to his senior ISIS position, Muslim remains the most revered even among Chechens in the group's ranks. Muslim has the most respect among Chechens, even those under Omar's command. He is a symbol, someone like Che in Raqqa. Chechens, the source continues, are among the major groups in the ISIS military forces. Quote, we call them here the four pillars. Iraqis, who are the most respected, being the initiators, then the Chechens, the Tunisians, and the Saudis. Unquote. Alright, so a couple things to take note of. Number one is that, again, these guys have a lot of influence, Omar al-Shishani and Muslim al-Shishani, especially in Raqqa, which is in Syria, a town in Syria, which has become the self-proclaimed capital of the Islamic State. And you should also take note of the fact that the Chechens are considered among the major groups in the ISIS military forces. In fact, they are one of the 4 pillars of ISIS's military strength. So, yes, indeed, Chechens are no stranger to ISIS. So we have Chechens who are in ISIS and Chechens who are in Ukraine fighting. Now, how do you link the two of them? Well, for that, we're going to turn to another article which appeared in The Intercept magazine or WordPress blog, whatever you want to call it. This is the new home of courageous journalist Glenn Greenwald, the keeper of Snowden's secrets. This is his new blog, and it's owned by billionaire Pierre Omidyar. So we're going to take a look at an article that appeared in this publication. Alright, this article was published on February 27th, 2015. It's titled Isa Munyev's War, the Final Days of a Chechen Commander Fighting in Ukraine. And that name should ring a bell to you if you've been paying attention here. Okay, this was one of the guys who founded the Islamic battalions. The article starts as follows. In September of 2014, I found myself standing on a narrow potholed street in Kiev east of the Dnieper River, in an area known as the Left Bank. I didn't even know at that point whom I was meeting. I knew only that Khalid, my contact in Turkey with the Islamic State, told me his quote-unquote brothers were in Ukraine and I could trust them. Alright, so we have this journalist for The Intercept traveled to Ukraine, and he had no idea who he was meeting, only that his contact Khalid, who lived in Turkey and who is a member of the Islamic State, aka ISIS, aka ISIL, aka Daesh, all that stuff, told this journalist that his brothers were in Ukraine and that, they're great guys, you can trust these guys, yeah, go give them a visit. So there you go. Yes, his brothers, the Islamic State brothers, are in Ukraine. Let's skip down now and we'll flesh this out just a little bit more. As Russian-backed separatist forces began battling Ukrainian forces, Munyev, that's Isa Munyev, came to Ukraine and established one of what would become several dozen private battalions that sprang up to fight on the side of the Ukrainian government, operating separately from the military. Munyev's group was called the Zhokhar Dudiev Battalion, named after the first president of independent Chechnya, who was killed by Russian forces in 1996. Munyev was the head of the battalion. He was not at the front in the fall of 2014 because he was busy training forces and organizing money and weapons from Kiev. An older man in a leather jacket introduced me to Munyev. Quote, "Our good brother Khalid recommended this man," unquote, the man said. Khalid is today one of the most important leaders of the Islamic State. Khalid and Munyev knew each other from years spent fighting together in Chechnya. Okay, so there you go. I mean, it doesn't get much more explicit than that. Khalid, this contact, the guy who sent this journalist to Ukraine to chat with his quote-unquote brothers, Khalid is actually one of the most important leaders of the Islamic State. And they also note here that Khalid and, again, Isa Munyev, the guy who started all these Islamic battalions, are good buds. They're chums. They're war pals. They knew each other from all those years they spent fighting together in Chechnya. So yeah, this is certainly an unusual development and something I think we need to keep our eyes on because as the U.S. is now shifting gears and striking at the Islamic State, with Operation Inherent Resolve, I believe it's called, where we're tracking ISIS to the gates of hell, as has been said. we should watch out that they may eventually track these guys into Ukraine, and that's certainly an unstable area right now after the revolution, and now we've had several months, maybe even a year of open fighting up in the east between Russian separatists and the puppet government that's taken over most of Ukraine. This is a dangerous situation, and the fact that ISIS is moving in there is something that we definitely need to keep our eyes on. But alright, let's bounce along now. We're already 20 minutes in here. The next story I want to cover is another one of these interesting stories that's going to pull two separate events together and form a nexus here, because this is Fast and Furious meets the Garland terrorist attack. So before I get into this particular story, I think we'll do a little bit of background on what the hell I'm talking about here. Now, we have two events. One was the terrorist shooting that happened in Garland, Texas, back in May of 2015. The other one is Operation Fast and Furious, and I know it hasn't been in the news much lately, so we'll just do a quick review here. So first of all, we'll just take a TV report here of a quick rundown on what happened in Garland, Texas.
Breaking overnight, a deadly scene in a Dallas suburb. 2 gunmen shot dead after opening fire and wounding a security guard outside an event center where a cartoon drawing contest of the Prophet Muhammad was being held. Law enforcement officials tell CNN the entire shooting lasted about 15 seconds.
We prepared for something like this.
The security officer, Bruce Joyner, was treated at a hospital for an ankle gunshot wound and released.
All right. And I have one more short clip here of some background on the 2 suspects who were involved in that Draw Muhammad contest shooting in Garland.
Meanwhile, authorities in Texas spent the day combing the scene for evidence. No explosives were found inside the vehicle, only luggage. One of the gunmen, identified by a federal law enforcement source as Elton Simpson, tweeted his allegiance to ISIS ahead of the attack. He also linked himself to a known British ISIS fighter. Sources tell CNN authorities believe Simpson shared an apartment in Phoenix, Arizona with a second gunman, Nadir Sufi.
All right, so that should catch you up there. Let's take a look now at Operation Fast and Furious, and this is a pretty good clip that'll give you all the background on this, and yeah, here we go.
Anderson Cooper 360, CNN weeknights at 8 and 10 Eastern.
Now tonight, keeping them honest, what newly uncovered memos say about the botched ATF operation we've been reporting on called Fast and Furious. The operation that let firearms bought in America get across the border into Mexico. The idea was to trace them to drug cartel leaders, but instead of tracing them, the ATF lost track of them. They never even informed the Mexican government about the weapons, and to add insult to injury, yet no one ever told the Mexican government about the entire thing. The whole thing was predicated on being able to follow these things, but no one told the Mexicans. So the U.S. is basically arming murderous Mexican drug cartels, and no one tells Mexico. We're not talking about a dozen or even a couple hundred guns. We are talking about thousands of weapons. Two of those weapons turned up at the murder scene of a U.S. border agent named Brian Terry. That is his photo. It's important we remember his name. Tonight, the GOP-controlled House Judiciary Committee asked the White House to name a special counsel to determine whether the Attorney General himself, Eric Holder, lied when asked about Fast and Furious. Here's what he said back in May.
When did you first know about the program, officially, I believe, called Fast and Furious? To the best of your knowledge, what date?
I'm not sure the exact date, but I probably heard about Fast and Furious for the first time over the last few weeks.
However, keeping them honest, we've obtained memos that show otherwise. Weekly reports from Holder deputies to the Attorney General. Weekly reports. One, dated the week of October 18th, 2010, talks about 8 pending indictments then under seal in connection with gun running to Mexico. Quote, the sealing will likely last until another investigation, Operation Fast and Furious, is ready for takedown.
All right, I got to cut off. Sorry, Anderson Cooper, we got to cut you off right there. Yeah, essentially, Operation Fast and Furious was our Guns for Drug Lords program that the United States government decided would be just a swell idea. That would just be great. And of course the whole thing cracked open when one of the guns was used to kill a Border Patrol agent. And as you could probably see in that report, the whole thing kind of got spun off into one of those classic who knew what when type of investigations, instead of looking at the bigger picture, which was like, hey, why the hell were we giving guns to these crazy, bloodthirsty drug lords? Yeah. But anyways, that's a typical congressional investigation. Once you get them on the scene, you can be sure the entire purpose of the whole thing will get lost, and it'll be spun off into something to score political points. So, yay, Congress! But okay, so what do these two things have to do with each other? I mean, you know, Fast and Furious was back in 2010. The Garland shooting is now we're in 2015. What am I talking about? Well, let's take a look at this article, which was published in the LA Times on August 1st, 2015. It's titled, Garland, Texas Shooter Bought Gun in 2010 During Fast and Furious. The article reads as follows. 5 years before he was shot to death in the failed terrorist attack in Garland, Texas, Nadir Sufi walked into a suburban Phoenix gun shop to buy a 9mm pistol. At the time, Lone Wolf Trading Company was known among gun smugglers for selling illegal firearms, and with Sufi's history of misdemeanor drug and assault charges, there was a chance his purchase might raise red flags in the federal screening process. Inside the store, he fudged some facts on the form required of would-be gun buyers. What Sufi could not have known was that Lone Wolf was at the center of a federal sting operation known as Fast and Furious, targeting Mexican drug lords and traffickers. So isn't that interesting? This guy bought a pistol from the store that just happened to be right at the heart of Operation Fast and Furious, right at the very time the whole program was going on, taking place out of that store. Huh. Okay, it gets better. Just wait. Hold on. Here we go. Continuing on, let's skip down another paragraph here. Sufi's attempt to buy a gun caught the attention of the authorities, who slapped a 7-day hold on the transaction, according to his February 24, 2010 firearms transaction record, which was reviewed by the Los Angeles Times. Then, for reasons that remain unclear, the hold was lifted after 24 hours, and Sufi got the 9mm. You should be scratching your head now. Hey, what? This guy went in, he lied on his form, right? He fudged some facts. So he basically lied, and it was so obvious that it caught the attention of the authorities, who slapped a 7-day hold on his purchase. This is how the system should work, right? There's nothing crazy about that. You got a guy who comes in, he's got some legal troubles in his past, he lies on his form, and the authorities find it, and they slap a hold on the transaction to review it. But then, for reasons that remain unclear, the hold was lifted after only 24 hours, and he bought the pistol. Alright, so continuing on, let's skip down a little bit farther in this article. A day after the attack, talking about the terrorist attack in Garland, Texas, the Department of Justice sent a, quote, urgent firearms disposition request, unquote, to Lone Wolf, seeking more information about Sufi and the pistol he bought in 2010, according to a June 1st letter from Senator Ron Johnson, chairman of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, to U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch. Though the request did not specify whether the gun was used in the Garland attack, Justice Department officials said the information was needed, quote, to assist in a criminal investigation, unquote, according to Johnson's letter, which was also reviewed by the Times. The FBI has so far refused to release any details, including serial numbers, about the weapons used in Garland by Sufi and Simpson. Senate investigators are now pressing law enforcement agencies for answers, raising the chilling possibility that a gun sold during the botched Fast and Furious operation ended up being used in a terrorist attack against Americans. So again, take note that the FBI is now refusing to release any details, including the serial numbers on the weapons that they recovered from the Garland shooting. I mean, this is pretty unbelievable. If you want to, but we'll take it straight from FBI Director James Comey's mouth. The article continues. Asked recently for an update on the Garland shooting, FBI Director James B. Comey earlier this month declined to comment. We're still sorting that out, he said. So yes, indeed, it's been, that was in May, and now this article was published in August. So like 2-3 months, and they're still sorting out the details on the guns and stuff. What exactly happened at this Garland, Texas shooting? Well, I think we have a pretty good indication now. One of the guns came from a government program that was arming drug lords, and, well, it looks like now is also arming terrorists. It's unfreaking real. But okay. So, we've got this development. Now, why exactly is this such bad news? Why is this so important? Well, you see, the FBI kind of has a history when it comes to terrorists of, sometimes facilitating them or helping them, giving them money, giving them inspiration, and sometimes even giving them guns to commit their terrorist attacks. Now that may sound crazy, but let's listen to a TED Talk which was given by a man named Trevor Aronson, who, let's just say he's done quite a bit of research on this topic.
The FBI is responsible for more terrorism plots in the United States than any other organization. More than Al-Qaeda, more than Al-Shabaab, more than the Islamic State, more than all of them combined. This isn't likely how you think about the FBI. You probably think of FBI agents gunning down bad guys like John Dillinger or arresting corrupt politicians. After the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the FBI became less concerned with gangsters and crooked elected officials. The new target became terrorists, and the pursuit of terrorists has consumed the FBI. Every year, the Bureau spends $3.3 billion on domestic counterterrorism activities. Compare that to just $2.6 billion combined for organized crime, financial fraud, public corruption, and all other types of traditional criminal activity. I've spent years poring through the case files of terrorism prosecutions in the United States, and I've come to the conclusion that the FBI is much better at creating terrorists than it is at catching terrorists. In the 14 years since 9/11, you can count about 6 real terrorist attacks in the United States. These include the Boston Marathon bombings in 2013, as well as failed attacks, such as the time a man named Faisal Shahzad tried to deliver a car bomb to Times Square. In those same 14 years, the Bureau, however, has bragged about how it's foiled dozens of terrorism plots. In all, the FBI has arrested more than 175 people in aggressive undercover counterterrorism stings. These operations, which are usually led by an informant, provide the means and opportunity, and sometimes even the idea, for mentally ill and economically desperate people to become what we now term terrorists. After 9/11, the FBI was given an edict. Never again. Never another attack on American soil. FBI agents were told to find terrorists before they strike. To do this, agents recruited a network of more than 15,000 informants nationwide, all looking for anyone who might be dangerous. An informant can earn $100,000 or more for every terrorism case they bring to the FBI. That's right, the FBI is paying mostly criminals and con men 6 figures to spy on communities in the United States, but mostly Muslim American communities. These informants nab people like Abu Khalid Abdul Latif and Wali Mujahid. Both are mentally ill. Abdul Latif had a history of huffing gasoline and attempting suicide. Mujahid had schizoaffective disorder. He had trouble distinguishing between reality and fantasy. In 2012, the FBI arrested these 2 men for conspiring to attack a military recruiting station outside Seattle with weapons provided, of course, by the FBI. The FBI's informant was Robert Childs, a convicted rapist and child molester who was paid $90,000 for his work on the case. This isn't an outlier. In 2009, an FBI informant who had fled Pakistan on murder charges led 4 men in a plot to bomb synagogues in the Bronx. The lead defendant was James Cromedy, a broke Walmart employee with a history of mental problems. And the informant had offered him $250,000 if he participated in that plot. There are many more examples. Today, The Intercept published my new story about a counterterrorism sting in Tampa involving Sammy Osmakash, a young man who was living near Tampa, Florida. Osmakash also had schizoaffective disorder. He too was broke, and he had no connections to international terrorist groups. Nonetheless, an FBI informant gave him a job, handed him money, introduced him to an undercover agent posing as a terrorist, and lured him in a plot to bomb an Irish bar. But here's what's interesting. The lead undercover agent, you can see him in this picture with his face blurred, would go back to the Tampa field office with his recording equipment on. Behind closed doors, FBI agents admitted that what they were doing was farcical. A federal judge doesn't want you to hear about these conversations. He sealed the transcripts and placed them under a protective order in an attempt to prevent someone like me from doing something like this. Behind closed doors, the lead agent, the squad supervisor, described their would-be terrorist as a retarded fool who didn't have a pot to piss in. They described his terrorist ambitions as wishy-washy and a pipe dream scenario. But that didn't stop the FBI. They provided Sammy Osmakash everything he needed. They gave him a car bomb. They gave him an AK-47. They helped him make a so-called martyrdom video. And they even gave him money for a taxi cab so he could get to where they wanted him to go. As they were working the sting, the squad supervisor tells his agents he wanted a Hollywood ending. And he got a Hollywood ending. When Sammy Osmakash attempted to deliver what he thought was a car bomb, he was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Sammy Osmakash isn't alone. He's one of more than 175 so-called terrorists for whom the FBI has created Hollywood endings. U.S. government officials call this the war on terror. It's really just theater, a national security theater.
Okay, well, if that interests you, you should definitely check out, he wrote a book called The Terror Factory, and it goes into a lot more detail on this. And yes, this is a trend where the FBI a lot of times helps out these so-called terrorists just to bust them. It's kind of like some kind of entrapment scheme or something. We're going to be looking at this a lot in future episodes of both the BS File and the Weekly News Roundup. So this is a common theme, and you should get used to it. And it'll help you understand a lot about what's going on in these terrorist attacks that we see in America. And in that vein, well, I have one more clip to play about the Garland, Texas shooting.
Minutes ago, law enforcement sources identified Nadir Sufi as the second gunman. Officials told CNN earlier in the day Elton Simpson from Phoenix was the other shooter. CNN Justice correspondent Pamela Brown is live in Garland, Texas. Pamela, law enforcement had at least one of the gunmen on their radar dating all the way back to 2006.
That's right. We know one of them, Elton Simpson, was on the FBI's radar, that there was an open investigation on him. But sources tell me there was no indication that Simpson and his roommate and accomplice Nadir Sufi were planning this attack, even though just hours before they arrived here in the black car behind me, one of them sent an ominous text.
So, make of that what you will, but obviously there's a lot more going on with this Garland, Texas shooting that we're not being talked about. And I'm sure the FBI is scurrying about trying to wrap up all the loose ends on this one. So they should just be lucky the two guys are wound up getting shot. Anyways, we'll have more to say about the FBI and terrorism in future episodes here, but we got to move along now, and we'll get to our next story here. Alright, the next article I want to cover appeared in the New York Times, again, right around the 1st of August of 2015, and this story is going to shed some light on some developments that have been going on in Syria for quite a long time, but this story is about the so-called, quote-unquote, moderate rebels that we have been funding, training, and equipping over there in Syria. So again, this article published in the New York Times, July 31st, 2015. And is titled, "The Rivals of ISIS Attack U.S.-Backed Syrian Rebel Group." The article begins as follows. A Syrian insurgent group at the heart of the Pentagon's effort to fight the Islamic State came under intense attack on Friday from a different hardline Islamist faction, a serious blow to the Obama administration's plans to create a reliable military force inside Syria. The American-led coalition responded with airstrikes to help the American-aligned unit known as Division 30 in fighting off the assault, according to an American military spokesman and combatants on both sides. The strikes were the first known use of coalition air power in direct battlefield support of fighters in Syria who were trained by the Pentagon. The attack on Friday was mounted by the Nusra Front, which is affiliated with al-Qaeda. It came a day after the Nusra Front captured 2 leaders and at least 6 fighters of Division 30, which supplied the first trainees to graduate from the Pentagon's anti-Islamic State training program. Alright, so we're laying a little bit of background here. So we have this group known as Division 30. These are Syrian rebels that we have sent through our Pentagon Train and Equip program, the $500 million Train and Equip program, to send these guys into Syria to fight ISIS. And this group was now attacked by a group called Jabhat al-Nusra, also known as the al-Nusra Front, who is an al-Qaeda affiliated group that have been in Syria since about the beginning. And this group is has a long history of working with al-Qaeda and ISIS at one point in time, although they go back and forth as to whether they like them or they don't, who's working with who. All you need to know is that this group, al-Nusra, is essentially the al-Qaeda branch in Syria, the official al-Qaeda branch in Syria. Alright, so our guys are getting attacked by al-Qaeda. Nothing too surprising there, right? Let's skip down and read some more from the article. While American military trainers had gone to great lengths to protect the initial group of trainees from attacks by Islamic State or Syrian army forces, they did not anticipate an assault from the Nusra Front. In fact, officials said on Friday, they expected the Nusra Front to welcome Division 30 as an ally in its fight against the Islamic State. This wasn't supposed to happen like this, said one former senior American official who was working closely on Syria issues until recently, and who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss confidential intelligence assessments. Hello, what does this tell you, folks? I mean, look at this. The Division 30, the people we train and equip, the moderate rebels that we've always heard so much about, they sent these guys in there and they expected that the Nusra Front, al-Nusra, the official al-Qaeda branch in Syria, I can't make that any more clear, the official al-Qaeda branch would welcome our guys that we trained as allies. They would be allies together. A former senior American official who was working on this stuff in Syria said, this wasn't supposed to happen like this. Alright, well, I know it sounds strange. Let's flesh it out a little bit more, shall we? Skipping down, we'll read a little more. Division 30's leaders expected to play a role in an ambitious new joint push by the United States and Turkey to help less radical Syrian insurgent groups seize territory from the fundamentalist militant fighters of the Islamic State, also known as ISIS, ISIL, ISIL, or Daesh. But the unit had no known plans to fight the Nusra Front, and the attacks on Thursday and Friday seemed to catch the unit off guard. Though the Nusra Front is allied with al-Qaeda, it is seen by many insurgents, and probably the U.S. too, just as a side note, many insurgents in Syria as preferable to the Islamic State, and it sometimes cooperates with other less radical groups against both the Islamic State and the Syrian government forces. So once again, our trained guys, the Pentagon's guys, Division 30 had no known plans to fight al-Nusra, to fight al-Qaeda. No, we're not worried about al-Qaeda, it's just ISIS. And it's also interesting to note that they say that the al-Qaeda group al-Nusra is often seen as preferable to the Islamic State. So I guess now al-Qaeda good, ISIS bad. But look, if it's not explicit yet, let me just scroll down and we'll take one more short paragraph from this article. In a statement on Friday, Division 30's leaders called on all nationalist Syrian insurgents to, quote, stand firm and proactively, unquote, against what they called an unprovoked attack, and asked, quote, the brothers in the Nusra Front, unquote, to stop the bloodshed and preserve the unity. I mean, that should make it clear. Once again, they're asking Division 30 leaders, our guys that the Pentagon has trained and equipped, are asking the al-Nusra Front, their brothers in the al-Qaeda branch, to stop the bloodshed. I wonder if they're brothers like ISIS's brothers with the Islamic battalions in Ukraine. Well, you tell me. But alright, so, they said that the attacks by al-Nusra seemed to catch Division 30 off guard. Well, let's look at the reason why that might have happened. The following article appeared in the British newspaper The Independent on August 1st, 2015. It's titled, Syria's rebel fighters recruited to fight ISIS but captured and beaten by Jabhat al-Nusra for collaborating with crusaders. And just a little background here, we'll take the first paragraph. Farhan al-Jassem is not a reluctant soldier, but sadness lurked behind his smile and deep brown eyes when he talked about the past 2.5 years he spent trying to fight what he considers the good fight in Syria. In a tea garden in southeastern Turkey last month, Lieutenant Jassem, 29, gulped down several bottles of water as he told the story of how he came to lead a key Syrian military brigade, trained and equipped by the U.S.-led coalition, receiving training and equipment from a U.S.-organized military coalition to take the fight to the Islamic State, ISIS. Alright, so this was an interview done by one of the leaders of one of the brigades in Division 30. Alright? These are our guys that we are training and equipping, our moderate Syrian rebels. So you might ask, why were these guys caught so off guard when al-Nusra came and captured them and then attacked their compound? Well, it might have something to do with this. Skipping down, let's take another paragraph from this article. At the time of his abduction, Lieutenant Jassem, 2 friends, and the colonel met their colleagues who were returning to Syria after several days in Turkey visiting relatives celebrating the end of Ramadan. The Nusra kidnapping was especially horrifying, Mr. Abu Muhammad said, because he and Lieutenant Jassem had met an Egyptian Jabhat al-Nusra leader just 10 days before and agreed that the 2 groups would leave each other alone. Quote, they said that if even one bullet reached them, they would attack us, but we assured that we were there only to fight Daesh, ISIS. The distraught commander said, still reeling from the betrayal. So yes, indeed, just 10 days before this whole attack took place, we see that commanders for the Division 30 were actually meeting with Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda branch, the official al-Qaeda branch in Syria. I can't hammer this in enough. They were meeting with them in Egypt, or maybe not in Egypt, but they were meeting with an Egyptian leader, and they were pretty much agreeing to a truce, like, hey, you don't bother us, we won't bother you, we're going to take out ISIS. So yeah, these guys are working together. So, what is the point of all this? Why am I reading this? Alright. What this essentially means, and what you need to understand about this, is that every time we have armed these moderate rebels, and I'm just going to name a handful of them, June 2012, when the New York Times published the article, CIA said to aid in steering arms to Syrian opposition. In June 2013, when the Washington Post published an article saying CIA preparing to deliver rebels arms through Turkey and Jordan. In January of 2014, when Congress secretly approves U.S. weapons flown to moderate Syrian rebels, as was reported by Reuters. Every time we have armed, equipped, paid, trained the moderate rebels in Syria, they have been Al-Qaeda, or allied with Al-Qaeda, or friendly with Al-Qaeda. I mean, they don't fight each other. We've been arming Al-Qaeda. That's crazy. It needs to stop. So there you go. I mean, it's pretty much proof that, yes, whenever you hear moderate rebels, you should think of Al-Qaeda. All right? Finally, let's move on to our last story here. We're going to talk about smash units, which you've probably never heard of. And this is absolutely one of the most disturbing stories that has come about recently, but also one that could be quite illuminating once you hear it. So if you're wondering what a smash unit is, well, let's take it right from the Express, the UK newspaper. This article was published on August 1st, 2015, and it's titled, SAS Dress Up as ISIS Fighters in Undercover War on Jihadis. Now, the SAS is the British Special Forces, essentially. The article reads like this. British Special Forces are mounting hit-and-run raids against Islamic State deep inside eastern Syria, dressed as insurgent fighters, the Sunday Express can reveal. The unorthodox tactic, which is seeing SAS Special Forces units dressed in black and flying ISIS flags, has been likened to the methods used by the long-range Desert Group against Rommel's forces during the Second World War. More than 120 members belonging to an elite regiment are currently in the war-torn country on Operation Shader, tasked with destroying ISIS equipment and munitions which insurgents constantly move to avoid coalition airstrikes. Okay, can you see some issues here? We have British Special Forces dressing in black and flying ISIS flags roaming throughout Syria, waging war against actual ISIS fighters dressed in black and flying ISIS flags. Okay, let's just read a little more, because it gets better. Though the Prime Minister is being kept informed, senior military sources last night told the Sunday Express that he would not be required to, quote-unquote, green-light every mission. Instead, the teams, part of a force known as the Coalition Joint Special Operations Task Force, are under American command, dubbed SMASH. The units, which travel in civilian pickups, can even launch their own unmanned aerial vehicles or mini-drones to scan terrain ahead of them and pinpoint ISIS forces. Using a U.S.-developed program, the UAV's camera system can identify any known high-value target, digitally transmitting the information as it happens to analysts on the ground. They are being supported by more than 250 specialists who provide additional communication support. Operating in small groups, the units reveal their coordinates to RAF, that's the British Royal Air Force, and coalition air forces, and are assigned a quote-unquote kill box, an area which will not be attacked by air while they are operating there. Okay, so I'm not going to get into it just yet, but just note these SMASH units are being commanded by the Americans, that it seems like no top-level officials are having to greenlight every single one of their missions, so they're pretty, they have some degree of autonomy. They're traveling around in civilian pickup trucks, they're launching mini-drones, they're assessing high-value targets, and they have a kill box where they will not be attacked. This is interesting. One final note here I just want to include that the article continues. Last week, an additional 20 SAS soldiers flew into Saudi Arabia to prepare a training system in which the UK will instruct hundreds of members of the Syrian moderate opposition as part of efforts by David Cameron to seek a support by Labour and the SNP on airstrikes over Syria. So once again, as we just looked at, the UK is sending people to Saudi Arabia, 20 Special Forces soldiers to Saudi Arabia to train Syrian moderate rebels, aka Al-Qaeda. So, I mean, this thing is just absolutely out of control. What's the point I'm making with all this? Well, it's insanely illuminating for me because I think back to those iconic pictures of ISIS convoys when they rolled into Iraq and steamrolled over Mosul and started taking the dams and all that stuff. Remember when that happened? When they really came on the scene. And they were rolling through the streets of Iraq in their brand new matching Toyotas, convoys of Toyotas, and they were all dressed in black, and they were flying ISIS flags. Oh. Yeah, doesn't that sound like, you know what that sounds like to me? Smash units! Smash units, yes! As British secret special forces dressed in black and flying ISIS flags who roll around in civilian pickups. Oh my gosh, smash units. I'll include a picture, a very famous picture of the ISIS convoys rolling through. You take a look at it. You tell me if that doesn't look like a smash unit. And in fact, back in May, the White House actually asked the U.S. news media to stop showing video of those convoys. That was back in May of 2015. They said, come on, you're making it look bad. Stop showing the videos of that on TV. Well, yeah, maybe they had other reasons to keep those pictures off of the television. Also, when I think about this, you know who I immediately think of? Jihadi John. You ever heard of this guy, Jihadi John? Well, if you haven't, let's pull up his biography on Wikipedia. He was the superstar of all the ISIS videos where they were beheading people and stuff like that. He was the guy who did the sign in all those videos, if you've ever seen him. So here's his biography, and we'll just take this right from the most trusted internet website ever, Wikipedia. Jihadi John, whose real name is allegedly Mohammed Emwazi, who was born Muhammad Jassim Abu Dakarim Olan al-Dafari in August 17th, 1998. We have a lot of details on this guy. I'm sorry, 1988. So Jihadi John is a Kuwaiti British man who is thought to be the person seen in several videos produced by the Islamic extremist group ISIL, showing the beheadings of a number of captives in 2014 and 2015. A group of his hostages nicknamed him Jihadi John since he was part of a 4-person terrorist cell with British accents whom they called the Beatles. And I'll just let that sink in for about a minute. A 4-person terrorist cell operating with ISIS, dressed in black, who all had British accents, who they called the Beatles. You know what that sounds like to me? Smash units! Smash units, smash units, smash units. Ah, man, it's unbelievable, really. Really, smash units? And hey, they're operating under American command, and that would be good. Somebody should ask some questions about these friggin' smash units. I think we deserve some answers on this stuff. Anyways, this stuff is absolutely crazy, and it goes right into the, in the BS file number 1, episode number 1 of the podcast, I talked about a document that came out of the the Defense Intelligence Agency, a declassified document that talked about how, the American government, Western governments, might not see the rise of ISIS as a terrible thing because it'll help destabilize the Assad regime in Syria. I'll throw in a link again to that declassified document. Very interesting. And all this stuff is adding up to the fact that, hey, maybe we weren't just going to let it happen. Maybe we send people in there to do the dirty work. You know, Jihadi John, the Beatles, all their greatest hits. Unbelievable. All right, that's it. That's the news roundup. We're right in an hour. I don't want to go anymore. I got, let me see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 more stories, so tune in next week. I'll keep pumping them out. So yeah, stick around. There's going to be more. I'm almost done with the third episode of the BS File, so look for that. It'll be coming out soon. All right, stay safe, and we'll see you next week.